Hi guys, welcome to the Hidden Motives crime series. Today, we're going to take a closer look at another unsettling case. Some cases leave answers behind, clear timelines, clear conclusions, a sense that, however painful, the truth is known. Then there are cases that do the opposite, cases where the more you dig, the less you seem to understand, where official conclusions clash with the evidence, where families spend years circling the same question: how did this happen? On the evening of January 26, 2011, in Philadelphia, 27-year-old Ellen Rae Greenburg was found on her kitchen floor. She had been stabbed 20 times, several wounds to the back of her neck and head. Within weeks, authorities closed the case: suicide. Almost immediately, doubts began to surface. Medical experts questioned the wound patterns. Her family struggled to reconcile the ruling with who Ellen was: a first-grade teacher, recently engaged, making plans for the future. If that conclusion was wrong, then the most important question had never been answered. More than a decade later, Ellen Greenburg's death remains officially closed. But for her family and for anyone who has studied the evidence, the case is far from settled. This is the story of Ellen Rae Greenburg, a story about evidence, doubt, and a single night that still demands one pressing question: was this truly a suicide, or something that will never be fully understood? Before her name appeared in headlines, before her death became the center of debate and controversy, Ellen Rae Greenburg was known for something quieter. She was known for being gentle, the kind of person who spoke softly, listened closely, and never sought attention. Yet somehow, people always turned to her anyway. Ellen grew up in a close-knit family in Pennsylvania. Her parents remembered her as thoughtful, responsible, and deeply compassionate. She did well in school, stayed close to her friends, and followed a path that reflected who she really was. She became a teacher, not just any teacher, a first-grade teacher. A job that demanded patience, emotional strength, and a warmth that couldn't be taught. Colleagues would later describe her as dedicated and caring, someone who worried about her students, someone who stayed late when they needed extra help, someone who took her responsibilities personally, because for her, teaching wasn't just a job. It mattered. Outside the classroom, her life seemed to be moving forward. In 2010, she became engaged to her boyfriend, Sam Goldberg. They had been in a long-term relationship and had recently moved into a small apartment together in Philadelphia. They were planning a wedding, looking at venues, talking about the future. To friends and family, it looked like the next step: two people building a life together. But behind the plans, there were signs that Ellen had been struggling. In the months leading up to her death, she began experiencing anxiety. According to medical records and family accounts, she visited several doctors. She reported feeling overwhelmed at times, especially from work. Teaching young children could be emotionally demanding, and Ellen took her responsibilities seriously, sometimes too seriously. She worried about doing things right, about meeting expectations, about not letting anyone down. Doctors prescribed anti-anxiety medication. There were adjustments to dosages, follow-up appointments, and conversations about stress and how she was coping. Her parents later said they knew she'd been feeling anxious, but they never believed she was suicidal. There were no notes, no messages about wanting to harm herself, and no history of self-harm or violent behavior. Friends described her as someone who talked through her worries, not someone who withdrew. And she had plans: wedding plans, future plans, everyday plans, the small things people make when they expect tomorrow to come. In the days before her death, she communicated normally with family and friends. Nothing in her messages suggested a crisis. Nothing suggested goodbye. Which is why, when the official ruling came, those who knew her struggled to reconcile it with the person they believed they knew. To investigators, Ellen's recent anxiety became part of the story. To her family, it meant something entirely different. Feeling stressed, feeling overwhelmed, seeking help. None of that was the same as wanting to die. The real question wasn't whether she was under pressure. It was whether that pressure could explain what came next. Because whatever was happening in Ellen's mind before January 26th, nothing in her life, her history, or her personality suggested the kind of violence she would later be found with. And that gap, between who Ellen was and how she died would become a central tension in the case. Investigators would focus on evidence, but for the people who knew her best, the starting point was simpler: who Ellen was, and whether the official story matched the life she had lived. January 26, 2011 was a cold winter day in Philadelphia. A snowstorm had blanketed the city. By late afternoon, streets were slick, sidewalks icy, and people were heading home early, trying to stay ahead of the weather. Inside their apartment in Manayunk, Ellen Greenburg was home with her fiancé, Sam Goldberg. Around 4:45 p.m., Sam left to go to the gym in their building. Ellen stayed behind, preparing food and planning to stay in the apartment while he worked out. Gym records later confirmed he checked in shortly after leaving. During that time, Ellen was alone. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, there were no witnesses, no phone calls, no messages. Whatever happened in that window of time happened unseen, unheard. About 45 minutes later, Sam returned. He later told investigators that something felt wrong the moment he reached the apartment door. The door wouldn't open. It had been locked from the inside using a swing bar latch, a security feature that lets a door open only a few inches unless disengaged from within. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. At first, he thought Ellen might be in the shower or wearing headphones. But as the minutes passed, concern grew. Unable to open the door normally, Sam forced his way inside. What he saw would become one of the most critical moments in the case. Ellen was on the kitchen floor. There was blood. A knife was in her chest. At 6:33 p.m., Sam called 911. His voice was urgent, shaken. He told the operator he had just come home and found his fiancée on the floor. At one point, he said, "I think she fell on a knife." As he looked closer, the reality became clear. There was more than one wound. The operator instructed him to perform CPR. The knife was still in her chest. The operator told him to leave it in place and keep trying to help. Paramedics arrived shortly after. By the time they reached the apartment, Ellen showed no signs of life. She was pronounced dead at the scene. From the beginning, several facts shaped the investigation. The apartment door had been secured from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry. No witnesses reported anyone entering or leaving. Outside, the snowstorm had been heavy enough that any footprints or unusual movement would likely have been noticeable. To first responders, it looked like the situation was contained. Whatever had happened behind a locked door. That detail, a locked door, would quickly become one of the most important pieces influencing how investigators interpreted everything else. But as the scene was examined more closely, another reality started to emerge. Because while the circumstances suggested isolation, the injuries themselves would raise questions no locked door could easily answer. When first responders entered the apartment, everything was quiet. There was no chaos, no overturned furniture, no broken items scattered across the floor. At first glance, the space looked untouched. Ellen lay on her back in the kitchen, near the counter. A serrated kitchen knife was still lodged in her chest. There was blood around her. But the apartment itself didn't reflect the kind of disorder investigators usually see in violent confrontations. There were no obvious signs of a struggle. No damage to walls. No objects knocked over. No indication anyone had moved quickly through the space. For investigators, the environment matters. Scenes often tell a story through disruption. What's out of place, what's broken, what's missing. Here, it was the opposite. The calm became part of the story. The apartment door, initial reports said, had been locked from the inside with a swing bar latch. Windows were closed. There was no sign of forced entry. If someone else had been there, investigators would have to explain how they got in, how they left, and why there was no trace of them. That question shaped the early assumptions, but as the scene was processed, other details complicated the picture. Investigators documented multiple wounds across Ellen's body, far more than what had been visible during the 911 call. Injuries to her chest, to her abdomen, to her scalp, to the back of her neck. Some were shallow, others deep. Blood patterns suggested there had been movement at some point, but there was no clear sign of a prolonged struggle in the apartment. In the sink, dishes were soaking. On the counter, food prep had been interrupted. Nothing suggested planning. Nothing suggested staging. but nothing clearly explained the sequence of events either. One of the most important questions at any scene is whether the physical evidence tells a consistent story. Here, the apartment suggested isolation. The injuries suggested intensity. That contrast, a calm space paired with severe trauma, would become a central tension in the investigation. Initially based on the number and nature of the wounds, the case was approached as a potential homicide. But the locked door, the lack of disturbance, and the absence of evidence pointing to anyone else made the picture more complicated. The scene seemed contained. The injuries did not. As the investigation continued, attention shifted from what the apartment looked like to what the autopsy would reveal about how those injuries actually occurred. If the apartment scene raised questions, the autopsy made them impossible to ignore. During the examination, the medical examiner documented the full extent of Ellen Greenburg's injuries. In total, there were 20 stab wounds. Some were superficial, others were deep and forceful. They were scattered across multiple areas of her body: the chest, the abdomen, the scalp, and most notably the back of the neck. 10 of the wounds were located on the back of her neck and rear of her head. Several of those penetrated deeply. One wound in particular stood out. It had severed Ellen's spinal cord. From a forensic perspective, that detail carried weight. Damage at that level would likely cause immediate, severe loss of motor function. The question investigators and later independent experts would ask was simple: if that injury happened early, how could additional wounds have been inflicted afterward? The examination also documented bruising in different areas of her body. Some were recent, others were in various stages of healing. There were small cuts and abrasions on her hands and arms as well. Interpretations of these findings became a point of contention. Some investigators believed the injuries were consistent with hesitation wounds and self-inflicted trauma. Others argued that the pattern, depth, and location of the wounds, particularly those to the back of the neck, were difficult to reconcile with suicide. Initially, the medical examiner ruled the manner of death as homicide, but that ruling did not last. In the weeks that followed, meetings took place between the medical examiner's office, police investigators, and the district attorney's office. They reviewed additional context: the locked apartment door, the absence of evidence of another person, Ellen's recent history of anxiety and medical treatment, the lack of defensive wounds normally seen in assaults. After those discussions, the manner of death was changed. The official ruling became suicide. According to the final determination, Ellen had inflicted multiple wounds on herself, including those to the back of her neck, before delivering the fatal stab to her chest. The knife remained lodged in place. For investigators, the ruling connected the forensic findings with the physical circumstances at the scene. But outside the official investigation, the autopsy became the most scrutinized part of the case. Independent forensic pathologists later reviewed the records. Some questioned whether the wound angles were even physically possible to self-inflict. Others focused on the spinal cord injury and whether continued movement afterward would have been realistic. Still others pointed to the sheer number of stab wounds, far higher than what is typically seen in knife suicides. The debate wasn't just about interpretation, it was about possibility. If the injuries were consistent with suicide, the case was tragically explained, but if they weren't, then the physical evidence might be pointing toward a very different conclusion. And that possibility would bring attention back to the people closest to Ellen, and to the unanswered questions surrounding that night. In the hours after Ellen was found, investigators focused on the person who had discovered her, Sam Goldberg. He had been the last known person to see Ellen alive. He returned to the apartment, forced the door open, and called 911. From the start, Sam cooperated fully with police. He laid out his timeline clearly. He left the apartment around 4:45 p.m. He went to the gym in the building. Security records later confirmed his keycard entry. He worked out for about 45 minutes. When he returned, the apartment door wouldn't open. The swing bar latch was engaged from the inside. He knocked. He called Ellen's phone. No answer. Concern turned to panic. Unable to enter normally, he forced the door open. Inside, he found Ellen on the kitchen floor and immediately called 911. Investigators checked for anything that might contradict his account. The timeline held. Gym records confirmed his presence. No surveillance showed him leaving during that time. No evidence placed him in the apartment when Ellen's injuries were believed to have occurred. He had no visible injuries suggesting a struggle. From an investigative standpoint, there were no immediate signs of conflict between the couple. Friends and family described their relationship as stable, engaged, planning a wedding, living together, moving forward. Sam was interviewed and released. He was never charged. He was never named a suspect. Officially, investigators said there was no evidence of foul play and no indication anyone else had been in the apartment. But as the case became more widely discussed, questions began to surface outside the official investigation. Some focused on the scene itself. How much force was needed to break the door open? Could the swing bar latch have been manipulated another way? Was the timeline precise enough to rule out every possibility? Others questioned the speed of the investigation. Why had the case moved so quickly toward a suicide ruling? Had every forensic possibility been fully explored before the manner of death was changed? There were even questions about influence. Sam's family had connections in the legal community. While no official findings ever suggested interference, the perception of potential influence became part of the public discussion. Through it all, Sam Goldberg has maintained the same position. He found Ellen. He called for help. He cooperated fully. He had no involvement in her death. To law enforcement, the evidence supported that conclusion. But for Ellen's family and independent experts challenging the suicide ruling, unanswered forensic questions kept the focus not just on what happened inside the apartment, but on whether the investigation had closed its scope too quickly. Because if the medical findings were still debated, then every timeline, every assumption, and every conclusion drawn that night remained part of a larger question. Not just who was there, but whether the full possibility of what happened had ever been examined. For Ellen's parents, the call that night was the start of a loss no family is ever prepared for. In the weeks that followed, their grief turned into something else: confusion, then doubt, then a growing conviction that something about their daughter's death didn't make sense. At first, they were told the case was being investigated as a homicide. Given the number of stab wounds, that seemed logical. 20 injuries, deep wounds, trauma to the back of the neck. But then the ruling changed. The manner of death was officially listed as suicide. To investigators, that conclusion fit the locked door scenario and the lack of evidence pointing to another person. To Ellen's parents, it felt impossible. They knew their daughter. Yes, she had struggled with anxiety. Yes, she'd been under stress at work, had seen doctors and taken medication, but she was planning a wedding, talking about the future, making everyday plans, staying in regular contact with family. There had been no goodbye messages, no suicide note, no history of self-harm. And most of all, they could not reconcile the nature of her injuries with the idea that she had inflicted them herself. So they began asking questions. When the answers they received didn't satisfy them, they sought their own experts. Over the years, the Greenburgs hired multiple independent forensic pathologists and medical specialists to review the autopsy, photographs, and reports. Several of those experts raised concerns. They questioned the angles and locations of the neck wounds, the force needed to penetrate bone, whether someone with a severed spinal cord could continue to inflict additional injuries. They also focused on bruising documented on Ellen's body, injuries they believed suggested a struggle rather than self-inflicted harm. For the family, the issue became bigger than disagreement. It became a fight for the official record. If Ellen's death wasn't suicide, then the cause of death listed on her certificate was wrong. And if the ruling was wrong, then the investigation that followed may never have fully considered other possibilities. Beginning in 2011, the Greenburgs launched a long legal effort to have the cause of death reconsidered. They filed civil actions, petitioned officials, requested reviews by medical examiners and prosecutors. Year after year, the case moved through legal channels. Some reviews acknowledged unanswered questions. Others upheld the original conclusion. But the ruling did not change. For Ellen's parents, the fight was never about assigning blame. It was about accuracy. about making sure the evidence was interpreted correctly. Because to them, the word suicide didn't just describe a manner of death. It closed a door. And as long as that door remained closed, they believed the possibility of the full truth, whatever that truth might be, would never be fully explored. More than a decade later, their position hasn't changed. They are not asking for certainty. They are asking for the case to be looked at again, from the beginning, with one question at the center. Was the conclusion reached, or was it assumed? As the years passed, the case moved beyond the apartment, beyond the autopsy, and into something more complex. A legal and institutional question. Not just what happened to Ellen Greenburg, but how her death had been investigated, and whether the system was willing to reconsider its own conclusions. The official ruling remained unchanged. Manner of death, suicide. With that determination in place, the case was considered closed. No criminal investigation, no reopening of the scene, no search for an alternative explanation. For Ellen's parents, that ruling became the central obstacle, because as long as the manner of death was suicide, the system had no reason to look further. So their efforts shifted to the courts. Over the next decade, the Greenburg family filed multiple legal actions seeking to have the manner of death changed to homicide or undetermined. Their argument was not that they knew exactly what happened. Their argument was that the evidence did not support the certainty of suicide. In hearings, independent experts testified about the forensic concerns, the neck wounds, the spinal cord injury, the bruising, and the overall injury pattern. At times, courts acknowledged the case raised legitimate questions, but changing an official manner of death is difficult. Medical examiner determinations carry legal weight. Unless new, definitive evidence appears, those findings are rarely overturned. In recent years, the case received renewed attention. Legal challenges pushed for additional reviews by the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office. Officials acknowledged the ongoing controversy and agreed to re-examine certain aspects of the findings. But after the review, the ruling did not change. The manner of death remained suicide. For the system, the case had been examined, reviewed, and reaffirmed. For the family, the questions remained exactly where they had been since 2011. Outside the courtroom, the case began to draw broader attention. Forensic experts publicly debated the injury patterns. Former investigators questioned the early handling of the scene. Legal analysts discussed the difficulty of overturning official determinations once they are set. The case became less about a single night, and more about a larger issue. What happens when a family believes a conclusion was reached too quickly? And how difficult is it to change that conclusion once the system has moved on? Today, more than a decade later, Ellen Greenburg's death occupies a rare and uncomfortable space, legally closed, officially explained, but still widely questioned. No arrests, no new investigation, no change to the record. Only a continuing gap between the official conclusion and the uncertainty that many believe still surrounds the evidence. Because in some cases, the mystery isn't just what happened, it's whether the final answer was ever truly found. Time passed, headlines faded, files were closed, the case was officially considered resolved. But for Ellen's family, there was no closure. They continued to fight, not for blame but for accuracy. For the record to reflect what they believed the evidence showed. They pushed for reviews, sought expert opinions, and pursued legal reconsideration. The case drew attention from journalists, forensic experts, and true crime audiences. Yet the official record remains the same. Suicide. No criminal investigation has been reopened. No charges have been filed. Still, doubt remains. The injuries, the scene, and the unanswered questions from that night continue to haunt the people who knew Ellen and those who continue to study her case. Unresolved questions. If the apartment door was locked from the inside, how could anyone else have entered? If the wounds were self-inflicted, how could someone stab themselves in the back of the neck multiple times and keep going? Could the original investigation have missed crucial evidence? Or did the suicide ruling close doors too soon? And if this wasn't suicide, who or what was never held accountable? Ellen Ray Greenburg was a young woman with a life ahead of her. She deserved answers. While the official record lists her death as suicide, doubt remains, and the full truth may still be waiting to be uncovered. If you found this story meaningful, join our community by subscribing and turning on notifications. Every subscriber helps us continue sharing stories that matter.